Kickstarter has been a bit of a blessing and a curse for the gaming industry. It's allowed smaller dev teams to fund projects that would have been impossible otherwise. But it's also created its fair share of cash grabbing. We're the Bullet Sponges and we are back with another MMO video, where we jump in and give you our thoughts on whether we think they're worth playing or not really worth your time. And if you feel like joining myself and Nex for more co-op reviews and let's plays, feel free to subscribe and join us each week as we review and play through all sorts of different titles. Today we're going to be looking at the Kickstarter funded Crowfall, and specifically taking a look if it's in a good state for its planned release in July. Crowfall is a massively multiplayer online role-playing game, which has received a massive $7.2 million in total funding. And since 2015 it's picked up a pretty big following of MMO fans patiently waiting for release. Crowfall is a third-person open-world fantasy game, with an exclusive focus on large-scale PvP, complete with guild vs guild warfare, siege warfare and time-limited campaigns. There are no dungeons or raids in Crowfall like you might find in Guild Wars 2 or World of Warcraft. Its core is entirely PvP, and while there is a PvE style experience at low levels, it's really only there to teach you the crafting, building and combat mechanics, and prepare you for your PvP endgame. And while there are many roles that players can take within the game, whether you decide to gather resources to supply the crafting players, or you want to craft to supply guilds and players with weapons and armour, it all still funnels down to the PvP gameplay. Planned to release on the 6th of July 2021, we jumped into Crowfall to find out how things were looking, and to let you guys know if we think it's ready to go, or needs a bit more time in the oven.
With a release around the corner, and as a PvP enthusiast, it's exciting to see that an MMO not centered around PvE could be added to the list of playable titles in this genre. And there are so many questions to ask. As its PvP focus, will there be a big grind? Will you be forced into time-gated progression? Will it be primarily skill-based? And what are the pros and cons of the current game design? These are aspects we're planning to go through on release, but here we're setting out early to the beta to give you a view of how the game fundamentally feels to play, and how ready it seems to be when it opens to the masses in July. Graphically, everything from the menus to the art style look AAA. The interface not quite as minimalist as you may want initially, but you realise that this might be a necessity for an MMO with so many features. And actually, we think it looks quite nice. And once you get used to why things are there, we started to really appreciate the placement of UI. The player models also feel quite connected to the physics of the world. Rather than just a character floating in the centre of your screen with a running animation, players have interesting movement animations like jumping effects. The guinea pig type race we picked had a double jump and a forward roll, making navigating around a more enjoyable experience, with each race having their own versions that have distinct gameplay benefits. Once you get your mount, travelling around is more of a positive experience too. Even though jumping on it slows your movement speed, it kind of makes sense and wasn't half as annoying as I thought it would be. It's nice to see that in Crowfall the race and class combinations has a real impact on how you'll play your character, and also that certain combinations aren't possible to pick due to what I assume are lore constraints. In a really crude way, I'd say Crowfall feels like a combination of Arcade, Guild Wars 2 and WildStar. There seems to be an attempt to put a number of their popular features in one package. Interacting with NPCs brings you into a more immersed one-to-one experience with them, and action combat removes the need for tab targeting, instead allowing you to focus on your positioning and focus on the enemy's model rather than just staring at their health bar. Some abilities are clearly telegraphed, and it will be interesting to see how much this is used. WildStar used this considerably, but there is probably a fine line between telegraphing everything for clarity and enjoying the environment without seeing green and red cones everywhere. The hitboxes at this stage, however, look a bit off. Your reach seems to be further than the model suggests, and skills didn't feel particularly impactful, something we'll explore further at higher levels for our release review. The questing element is also highly questionable in my opinion, sending you back and forth to speak to the next person and looting 10 of this and that. Maybe we lack the appreciation for following the story here, but we felt the need to skip dialogue so we could move on and find something interesting to do. Over our playtime, we came across a number of minor issues. We actually couldn't party up the entire time, so just had to stay near each other, and therefore couldn't cover the co-op team play aspect at all. Abilities can't be used in the air, reducing a number of combat possibilities in PvP. Full damage was strangely out of sync with the animation. Even after making and looting a few pieces of armour, every piece seemed to look the same, with Bias and I looking identical the whole time even as different classes. Now it's entirely possible these things might have already been explained in developer notes, but we can only comment on our experience in game. Finally, although PvP focused, there is still a PvE element, and there are a few issues that I feel like older MMOs have already been through and resolved. If you're fighting the same target as someone else in another party, the person who dealt the most damage gets the loot, seemingly favouring particular specs or whoever has the better gear. And quests haven't been designed with multiple participants in mind, by either spawning countless versions of a quest mob or having to wait for quest items to spawn if others get there first. With all that's been said, ultimately Crowfall will be about its PvP experience, and that's something we'll discuss in detail upon release. But as it stands, we're on the fence about the state of Crowfall currently. If this was an alpha, we would have been really impressed. There is enough for any player to understand what type of game Crowfall wants to be, but I think it's hard to justify if it's actually there yet from what we've seen.
It's great to see an MMO so committed to providing players with a PvP-based experience. Since the days of early PvP MMOs like Shadowbane and Dark Age of Camelot, there's been a subset of the MMO community waiting to get their hands on something that fills this niche. We both came into Crowfall looking to find out if it's ready for full release, and that question has a bit of a complicated maybe answer. At this point, the game's been in development for around 6 years, and the fanbase seems to be running out of steam waiting for a finished product. Having played the game myself a few years ago, I can see there's been a huge stride forward with development, especially and importantly to the new player experience. Crowfall provides players with an interesting stage in which to enjoy a full PvP MMO. There are different roles for harvesters, crafters and PvP combatants, with multiple classes and races to choose from. So whether you want to collect building materials to contribute to a town's or fort's capabilities, forge weapons for guilds, or simply dive into combat against other players, Crowfall caters to a pretty broad range of playstyles. In addition, the game has a pretty unique structure, and the game allows characters to exist outside of playable servers, allowing you to take your character and engage in different campaigns. Each campaign will be procedurally generated and will have its own time frame, meaning a beginning and an end, which can range anywhere from a few days to an entire year. And this beginning and end gameplay loop I personally think is a great idea to stop the game from getting stale. Graphically, the game has a nice aesthetic, and everything from the graphics, the art style and the menus all have a polish you'd expect from a AAA title. And we have the gameplay itself. The game's direction to move away from traditional tab targeting towards more action combat works really nicely in the game setting, and I think that action combat will go a long way in helping the large-scale PvP fights feel like you're engaged in the fight. Overall, we had a good amount of fun in the time we played, and while there were a few issues that needed ironing out, we think it has a lot of potential to be a really interesting PvP game. And for its readiness for full release, I think releasing the game this year is the right thing to do. It's now at a stage where people can enjoy it and new players have a guided experience, and waiting any later might risk losing some of the dedicated fans from the beginning. After the game is fully released, we plan on jumping back into Crowfall for a full review. For now, let us know in the comments what you think of the game and whether or not you agree with what we've said. We're the Bullet Sponges, and we'll see you in the next one.